The Black Tie Betrayal, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins at a formal evening gathering where polished shoes, elegant gowns, and perfectly tied black ties hide the village's most carefully kept secrets. In St. Mary Mead, such events are meant for polite conversation and harmless celebration, never suspicion. But when the evening takes a sudden, shocking turn, the atmosphere of charm and laughter collapses into something far more chilling. Miss Marple notices what others try to ignore: the strained smiles, the rushed excuses, and the single moment where trust quietly broke in front of everyone. A black tie can signify elegance or concealment. And as Miss Marple gently retraces the events of the night, she realizes the betrayal did not begin when the tragedy occurred. It began long before the guests ever arrived. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the most refined gatherings can hide the deepest treachery. Before we uncover who was behind the black tie betrayal, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Black Tie at Midnight. Rain had been falling over the village since early evening, cold and steady, the sort of rain that made the roads shine like black glass and turned the gardens of Harrow Hall into dark patches of dripping earth. The great house stood on the hill like an old king, tall and proud against the storm, its windows glowing gold in the night. From the outside, it looked warm enough, safe enough. But inside, the mood was different, tight, uneasy, like a room holding its breath. Sir Leonard Vale was not a man known for entertaining. He was wealthy, certainly, and Harrow Hall had seen its share of grand dinners over the years, but those days had mostly gone. Since his wife's death, Sir Leonard had become sharper, colder, more private. He kept to business and expected the world to behave itself around him. It rarely did. So when invitations for a formal black tie supper arrived that week, people noticed, and people talked. Miss Marple noticed too. She arrived just before 9, stepping carefully from the motor car, her coat pulled tight against the rain, knitting bag under her arm. Miss Marple's niece Helen had insisted she come, saying it might do her good to get out. But Miss Marple hadn't come for company. She'd come because something about Sir Leonard's invitation felt urgent, almost nervous. That interested her. Inside, the drawing-room was bright with firelight and full of careful smiles. Edward Vale, Sir Leonard's nephew, stood by the mantel, glass in hand, looking handsome enough, but distracted. His smile came quickly, too quickly, and his fingers tapped the glass without him noticing. Miss Marple had seen that sort of restless movement before. It usually meant worry. Arthur Bell, Sir Leonard's business partner of 20 years, was near the fire, already on his second whisky. Arthur was a broad man, red-faced and loud by nature, but tonight his laughter sounded forced, and every few minutes he glanced at Sir Leonard as if trying to judge his mood. Lady Beatrice Crane stood by the window in black silk, elegant as ever, her diamonds catching the firelight. Years ago she'd nearly married Sir Leonard before choosing another man instead, one with more money and weaker lungs. Now she was a widow herself, and back in Sir Leonard's circle. Strange thing, life. It likes bringing old stories back around. Then there was Dr. Miles Fenwick, the village doctor, thin, pale, tired-looking, forever adjusting his spectacles. He looked uneasy from the moment he stepped inside. Whether it was the weather or the company, Miss Marple couldn't yet tell. And then there was Sir Leonard himself. Standing by the fire, dressed perfectly in black evening clothes, his silk tie tied sharp and neat, his silver hair brushed back, his face hard as stone. But there was strain there. Miss Marple saw it at once. Sir Leonard looked like a man carrying something heavy in his pocket, something worse than money. Dinner was announced at 9, and the party moved into the long dining room, all candlelight, silver trays and polished crystal. It was beautiful in the way old wealth often was, elegant but cold, the kind of room where secrets would sound louder. Sir Leonard sat at the head of the table, watching everyone, not speaking much, just watching. The meal began simply enough. Soup, fish, roast, all served properly by silent servants who seemed to sense the tension themselves. Conversation stayed on safe ground: weather, village gossip, horses, politics, the usual rubbish people used when avoiding the truth. But truth has a smell to it, and Miss Marple could feel it sitting at the table with them. Halfway through dinner, she caught Edward leaning towards Arthur Bell, whispering shortly, "Does he know?" Arthur didn't look at him. "Quiet," he muttered. That was all, but enough. Miss Marple's needles paused for half a second before carrying on. Across the table, Lady Beatrice watched Sir Leonard in silence. There was something odd in her face. Not affection, not anger, fear. And not fear for him, fear of him. Dr. Fenwick hardly ate at all. He kept glancing at Sir Leonard's wine-glass, then looking away quickly. That Miss Marple noticed too. By the time dessert arrived, the storm outside had grown worse. Rain slapped against the windows, and wind shook the old trees hard enough to scrape branches against the glass. Sir Leonard hadn't eaten much. He kept reaching into his pocket, touching something there, a folded envelope. Paper, important paper, evidence perhaps. Then, at exactly 11 o'clock, Sir Leonard pushed back his chair and stood. The scrape of the chair against the floor silenced the room at once. He lifted his glass, looked at each face one by one, slowly, carefully. Then he spoke. "My friends," he said, his voice calm but tight, "I asked you here tonight because there's been a betrayal, a serious one. Before midnight, I intend to name the person responsible." The words struck the room like thunder. Edward froze. Arthur Bell's face lost color. Dr. Fenwick gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles whitened. Lady Beatrice gave the faintest smile, like she'd expected this moment. Sir Leonard reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope. Proof. Whatever was inside it had power, enough to ruin somebody. And then the lights went out. Everything. Darkness swallowed the room whole. A sharp gasp broke the silence. A chair crashed backwards. Quick footsteps crossed the floor. Then came a choking sound, low, wet, ugly. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then the lights came back. Sir Leonard Vale was slumped forward over the table, motionless, his face pressed against the silver tray, dead. His black silk tie had been pulled tighter, far tighter, so tight it cut into the skin of his throat. And the envelope he had been holding was gone. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Miss Marple looked around the table. Edward looked pale as death. Arthur Bell looked frozen where he sat. Dr. Fenwick looked terrified. But Lady Beatrice, she wasn't looking at Sir Leonard. She was staring at the black tie.
and in that moment, while thunder rolled over Harrow Hall and the dead man sat at the head of the table like a grim host, Miss Marple understood one thing. Sir Leonard hadn't just died. He'd been silenced, and someone at that table knew exactly why.
Chapter 2. The Knot That Shouldn't Be There. Morning came grey and wet over Harrow Hall, the rain easing into a thin mist that clung to the gardens and stone walls like breath on glass. The storm had passed, but the house still felt caught in it somehow, quiet, heavy, like the air itself knew something ugly had happened. The dining room remained untouched. Sir Leonard's chair stood at the head of the table, pushed back slightly from where he had risen the night before. Half-empty glasses sat forgotten beside cold silver dishes, and the candle wax had hardened where it had dripped. Death always left a room changed. Even after the body was gone, something stayed behind. No one looked rested. Edward Vale appeared at breakfast, pale and sharp-eyed, his collar fastened badly as though he'd dressed in a hurry. He barely touched his tea, only stirred it again and again, lost somewhere in his thoughts. Arthur Bell looked worse. The colour had drained from his face, and the cheerfulness he'd worn the night before had vanished completely. He smoked one cigarette after another near the fire, filling the room with thick smoke and saying very little. Lady Beatrice seemed the calmest of them, dressed perfectly, her face smooth and unreadable, but Miss Marple noticed the slight stiffness in her shoulders. Calm was often the neatest disguise. Dr. Fenwick looked dreadful. His eyes were red, his hands unsteady, a man carrying something too heavy in his mind. Inspector Graves arrived just after 7, wet coat, muddy boots, and a face that looked made for bad news. He was practical, sharp, and not much interested in niceties. The doctor's report came quickly. Poison. Something strong and fast slipped into Sir Leonard's wine. Death within minutes. Inspector Graves seemed pleased enough with that answer. Poison was simple, clean. It gave him a clear path. But Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting and thought otherwise. Because poison explained the death, it didn't explain the tie. She remembered Sir Leonard's black silk tie clearly, neat at the start of dinner, a plain knot, tied the way older gentlemen often tied them out of habit. But when the lights came back, the knot was tighter, different. Someone had re-tied it, or tightened it, after the poison. That meant someone had gone near the body in the dark, and that meant the darkness itself had been useful, very useful. The questioning began in the drawing-room. Edward went first. He claimed he hadn't moved when the lights failed, said he'd been too shocked to do anything but sit still. A neat answer. Too neat. Miss Marple noticed mud on the edge of his shoe. Fresh mud. Not much, but enough. Odd for a man who'd spent the whole evening indoors. She tucked that in her mind. Arthur Bell was next. He said he'd stood by his chair and heard Sir Leonard choking in the dark, but couldn't see a thing. His voice was rough. His hands shook when he lit his cigarette afterwards. And there, caught near his sleeve, Miss Marple spotted something tiny, a black silk thread, almost invisible, but there, from the tie. That was certain. Lady Beatrice gave her statement calmly. She said she had screamed and reached across the table when the lights failed, thinking someone had fallen. But one of her gloves had a tear at the finger, a sharp tear, as though caught on something rough or grabbed. Miss Marple noticed that too.
Dr. Fenwick's turn was the strangest. He admitted he'd seen Sir Leonard looking unwell during dinner, nervous, sweating. But when asked why he hadn't spoken up, the doctor hesitated. Too long. Long enough for suspicion to settle over him like dust. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple wandered through the house, quiet as usual, her knitting tucked under one arm. People ignored old women wandering halls. That was useful. She stepped into Sir Leonard's study. It was neat, too neat, the sort of neatness that felt arranged. On the desk sat an open ledger, numbers, payments, and tucked inside one page, half hidden, was a letter. Miss Marple unfolded it. A bank record. Arthur Bell's name. A large payment, made only 3 days earlier. Far too large to be ordinary. Money. There it was. Money sat behind more murders than love ever did. Then the butler appeared at the doorway, pale as paper. He hesitated before speaking. Said he'd heard raised voices in the study before dinner, Sir Leonard and Edward arguing, Sir Leonard accusing Edward of taking money from the business accounts, Edward denying it, loudly. Family and money, a poisonous mix. By evening, Harrow Hall felt smaller somehow, the walls closer, the silences heavier. Miss Marple sat in the parlor while rainwater slid down the windows, watching the guests move about like uneasy shadows. That's when Dr. Fenwick made a discovery. One bottle was missing from his medicine bag, a sleeping draught, strong enough in heavy measure to stop a heart. Fenwick swore he hadn't touched it, and Miss Marple believed him, mostly, because his fear looked genuine. Not the fear of a guilty man, the fear of a trapped one. As night settled over Harrow Hall again, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She laid it all out in her mind. Poison in the wine, a missing bottle, money gone missing, an argument, mud on Edward's shoe, silk on Arthur's sleeve, a torn glove on Lady Beatrice's hand, and that black tie, that dreadful black tie. Sir Leonard had promised to name a betrayer, and someone made sure he never could. But murder was messy. People always leave pieces behind, and Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that one of those pieces would lead her straight to the truth. The only question now is this: who at that table feared Sir Leonard's truth enough to kill for it?
Chapter 3. The Final Knot. The second night at Harrow Hall settled in with a slow heaviness, as though the house itself was reluctant to breathe. Rain returned in thin, patient sheets, sliding down the tall windows and pooling in dark shapes along the gravel paths outside. The wind moved through the old chimneys with a low, uneven sound, like something thinking too hard in the dark. Inside, everything felt compressed, quieter than before. Not peaceful, just waiting. Dinner had been almost silent, the sort of silence that isn't natural, but forced into place by fear and exhaustion. Edward Vale picked at his food without looking at it. Arthur Bell sat hunched forward, his usual loudness gone entirely, replaced by a restless stillness. Lady Beatrice remained composed, perfectly dressed, perfectly still, though her eyes followed every movement in the room with careful attention. Dr. Fenwick barely touched his plate, his hands unsteady each time he lifted his glass. Miss Marple sat among them, knitting as usual, though her eyes did far more work than her hands. She had learned long ago that people reveal themselves not in what they say, but in what they avoid saying when they think no one is watching. Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace after dinner, his expression unchanged, his voice steady.
The facts had not changed. Sir Leonard Vale had been poisoned at the table, fast-acting, precise, deliberate. The medical evidence was clear enough for him. But Miss Marple was no longer interested in what was clear. She was interested in what had been altered, especially the black silk tie, because poison explained the death, but the tie explained something else entirely. After dinner, she asked once again to see Sir Leonard's study. No one objected. There was a kind of passive obedience in the house now, as though resistance required energy no one had left. The study was as she remembered it, too neat, too controlled. But now, with time and knowledge, it felt less orderly and more carefully arranged. The fireplace still held the remains of burnt paper, though someone had clearly tried to destroy whatever had been inside in haste. Miss Marple sifted through the ash gently. Patience always revealed what urgency tried to hide. And there it was, another fragment, a partial financial record. Not just Arthur Bell this time. Edward Vale's name appeared too, tied into the same network of payments. Not direct, not obvious, but there, enough to suggest connection, enough to suggest fear. Money again, always money. She folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. Then she noticed the desk. A faint scratch across the polished wood, fresh, as though something heavy had been dragged across it quickly, without care, not placed, not set down, moved in haste or panic. The butler arrived shortly after, hesitant and pale. After some prompting, he admitted that Sir Leonard had summoned Edward to the study 2 nights earlier. There had been a fierce argument, raised voices, sharp accusations about missing funds and dishonesty. Edward had left in a fury. That much, the butler said, he would never forget. By late evening, Harrow Hall had settled into a strained quiet. The guests drifted through the corridors or stayed behind closed doors, each alone with their thoughts, none willing to share them. The house felt smaller somehow, as though secrets were pressing the walls inward. Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, knitting slowly, watching everything without appearing to watch at all. That was when Arthur Bell made his mistake. He thought he was alone near the window, half hidden in shadow, turning something over in his hand, something small, a black silk thread, the same material as Sir Leonard's tie. Miss Marple saw it at once. Arthur's hand closed too late. Their eyes met briefly. No words were spoken, but something passed between them in that silence, recognition and alarm. Arthur moved away quickly, but the moment had already settled into place. That thread mattered more than it should. Later, Dr. Fenwick spoke quietly to Inspector Graves. Another item was missing from his medical case, a stronger sedative, one he kept only for emergencies. He insisted he had not taken it, nor used it. Miss Marple believed him, not because of trust, but because fear like that was too disordered to belong to guilt. It belonged to confusion, to being used, to being caught in something already in motion before he understood it. When the house finally quieted for the night, Miss Marple stayed by her window. Outside, the rain softened again, and the garden lay pale under the moonlight, every hedge and rosebush heavy with water. Somewhere beyond that glass, the truth sat waiting, not hidden, just overlooked. Sir Leonard Vale had called his guests together to reveal a betrayal. He had never managed to speak it. Someone had ensured that. But in doing so, they had made a mistake, because murder does not erase truth, it scatters it, and scattered things are always found. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in her lap. She thought of the torn glove, the mud on Edward's shoe, the silk thread on Arthur's sleeve, the missing bottles from Dr. Fenwick's case, the argument in the study, and most of all, the black tie, that altered knot, that deliberate change. Someone had touched Sir Leonard Vale after death, not in panic, not by accident, but to control what others would believe had happened. And that meant one thing above all else. The killer had stood close enough to the body to shape the story. And that was where they made their fatal mistake, because Miss Marple was already watching the shape of it, and the truth, once noticed, never stayed hidden for long. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe, because the next secret in Harrow Hall is already waiting, and it may be closer than you think.